Okay, we're back to one verse today. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. It says this, by faith, Rahab did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about Rahab this morning. Rahab, interestingly enough, is mentioned more times in the New Testament than even people like Joshua. So Rahab, even though she plays seemingly a pretty small role in the whole story of the Old Testament, is actually very central to how people understood the gospel moving forward. So let's dig into the story of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. And the background was Israel is right along the border of entering the promised land, this place where God said, I'm going to give you this land, and you're going to prosper there, and you're going to be a blessing to the nation. And they're right on the cusp of entering the land. But before they enter the land, there's the city that stands in the way, and that city is Jericho. So what they do is they send spies to scope it out and see what's going on in the city of Jericho. And here's what it says in Joshua chapter 2. And it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel had come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. But the woman who had taken the two men had hidden them. And she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. Okay, so she's lying. She's lying here. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. So what I want to take a look at is Rahab's journey, and I'm going to frame this in a really simplistic way, but I'm hoping that even though this message is very simple, God will actually speak to us in a way that challenges us. Okay, so when I look at Rahab's journey of faith, I'm just going to break it up into three sort of phases. Okay, the first one is she heard. Everybody say heard. So there's this hearing phase to her journey. Okay, secondly, she believed. Everybody say believed. So there's this believing phase to her journey. And lastly, there was action. Everyone say action. So she had this doing phase to her journey where she took what she heard, she took what she believed, and she actually acted on it. Okay, so let's see where the hearing comes in. Hearing the news comes in verse 8 through 10. In verse 8, here's what it says. Before the men lay down, so this is just a continuation of what we read, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land and that the fear of you has fallen upon us and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have, look at that word, heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan in Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. So Rahab had heard. She had heard this news. Somehow news traveled throughout the nations within the deserts that there was this foreign God that was doing these things, that there were these miracles happening. One of the miracles was that the Red Sea had dried up. That's pretty crazy news if you hear that. That's almost news that you wouldn't want to believe, right? Like, what do you mean the sea dried up? That doesn't make sense. The other news they had heard is there are these powerful nations, Sihon and Og, and yet this band of traveling nomads somehow defeated these powerful nations in the wilderness. So news had reached Jericho, and that news was very scary to the people of Jericho. They heard, Rahab heard. You might have heard things. Every time there's a message given, you hear. It goes in your ear. It goes in your brain. You hear, right? And here's what I want to say about hearing. Hearing is a start, but it doesn't really matter. So what if you hear? Think about the people she mentioned. She said, other people have heard. Right? Her whole nation, her whole city had heard these things. But so what if you heard? No matter how amazing the truth is, it's not going to change your life if all that happens is you hear. And you come on Sunday, you hear a sermon. So what? right? And I've said before, you can probably hear many sermons much better than this one. And someone said amen, right? It doesn't matter how much you hear. Think about this. How many people in the West have a vague idea of what the gospel is? I know in Taiwan it's a little bit different. I was talking to Jake and Carissa this week, and he was saying, in Kaohsiung, people don't know the gospel at all. And when you talk about Easter, they have no idea what Easter is. But think about the West. Think about America. Think about Canada. How many people in America and Canada have heard and have some vague idea what the gospel is? I would say 95%. But does it matter that they hear? So what? So what if they hear? How many Christians have heard that God provides or that God heals? But yet how many Christians live as if God doesn't provide and God doesn't heal? It doesn't matter if you've heard. That's sort of this step along the journey, but we can't stop there. The next step is she believed. Look at verse 11 through 13. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is in the heavens above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord, as I have dealt kindly with you, you will also deal kindly with my father's house and give me a sure sign, that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. Do you see the progress, right? She heard the news. But not only did she hear the news, she believed what the news implied, and she gave her trust over to the news. I've heard there's this God that's doing these great things, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to now put my trust in that God who I heard is doing these great things. Do we see the progression? Not only was there hearing, but there was believing. Let me tell you something, church. Look up here, look up here. Eyes up here. I don't care if you believe, because believing doesn't really matter in the long run. I don't care if you believe. God doesn't care necessarily if you believe, because believing doesn't really matter in the long run. Here's what I mean. I once went to a high school retreat where a very serious spiritual situation arose. Okay, I'm not going to get into the details, but just remember I came from a charismatic church. So a very, very, very serious spiritual situation arose, and we did not know how to handle it. We did not know what to do. And it wasn't an isolated case. It was everywhere in our retreat. Things were happening to very many people that you would not expect. Our pastor did not know what to do. But fortunately, he took a class in seminary that addressed how to handle these sort of spiritual situations. So what did he do? He called his professor in the middle of the night, because we had been dealing with this situation for days now. So he called his professor in the middle of the night, and he asked his professor, how do we deal with this serious spiritual situation? You know what his professor said? His professor said, I study that stuff and I believe that stuff, but I don't practice that stuff. He never called his professor again. He called someone else who didn't just believe, who didn't just know, but actually did something about it. And so oftentimes we are very, very comfortable in the belief phase of our journey because it's pretty safe. But I want us to see that Rahab didn't just hear the news of this God that was doing amazing things. Rahab didn't just believe in her mind what this God was doing and put her trust. The most critical part to her growth and our growth is step 3, and that's the action, the doing. She acted on her belief. Look at verses 14 through 16. Verse 14, and the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Then she let them down by a rope through a window, for her house was built into the city wall, and so that she lived in the wall. And she said to them, go to the hills, or the pursuers will encounter you, and hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Then afterwards you may go away. So she heard, she believed, and she actually acted on that belief to help the spies. I want us to take a moment to think about how difficult it is for Rahab to live out this newfound belief in the environment she's in. Think about this for just a moment. She's acting on a truth she just heard in an environment that is hostile to that truth and to that God. Everything she grew up believing is being questioned. Her family believes something different. Her family believes in other gods. And now the God that she is believing in and trusting and acting on is this foreign God who is going around destroying cities all around her. Think about that. I read a book a few years ago about this person who grew up Muslim. And I think many of us who grew up in Christian environments or Christian homes really have a hard time grasping just how difficult it is to act out our faith when everyone around us and everything we've learned is actually against that. But yet she did. Think about in your workplaces, acting out your faith in your workplace in an environment that operates very differently than how our God asks us to operate. Think about in the business world when we're being asked to trust God, but the business world says to strategize. Not that they're mutually exclusive. Think about in some of your friend groups who want to live a certain way, but your faith dictates that you live the opposite way, how difficult that could be. Take that times 10, that's what Rahab is going through. I'm living in a city where everyone is against this God, and everyone feels this God is coming after them, and now I'm helping the people of this God. But that's why I think Rahab is such a beautiful picture of this faith in action, that it's faith coupled with obedience. And that's why Rahab, of all people, right, is actually mentioned in James chapter 2. James chapter 2 says this: you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. We know this passage. And in the same way, was not also Rahab justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as a body apart from the spirit is dead, so is faith apart from also faith apart from works is dead. Rahab is being used as this example in James of, look, if you just believe, who cares? That's dead. If you just believe, that's dead. You have to take what you believe and live it out by doing and in action. Romans 10 also lays this out pretty beautifully, and I want to connect it more to us, okay? Romans 10, verse 14 says this: and then they will call, or how then will they call on him whom they have not believed? See, that's like phase 2, right? Belief. And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? That's phase 1. Just you hear the news. And how are they to hear without some preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach good news. Look at verse 16. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. See what happened? They got stuck in hearing or stuck in believing. Right? And you and I are all sort of go through these cycles in various aspects of our faith where sometimes maybe we've heard for the first time. Maybe we come to church and the message challenges us and we hear it. Maybe some of us are in phases of our Christian life where we do believe. We say, yes, I agree with this. Yes, this is true. And maybe some of us are in phases of our life where we're actually acting on that belief. And we go through these cycles and we go back and forth, and it's not always this linear thing. Sometimes we're doing well. Sometimes we're moving from believing to doing, but sometimes we're right back to just believing. Sometimes we're just in the hearing phase and we don't want to move forward on what we hear because you know what? Actually doing something about what we hear demands such a radical life change that it makes us uncomfortable. I think of the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler wanted information. What was the information he said? How shall you inherit eternal life? Jesus gave him the information. He heard, but he wanted nothing to do with it. He didn't want to believe. Some of us are satisfied in the belief phase. The belief phase is great. You know why? Because it makes us feel like we're right with God. The belief phase is super, super comfortable because it's easier to submit your life to a truth than it is to submit your will to the truth. Isn't it? So I feel like, okay, I acknowledge and believe what God is saying, so I'm right with God. And that's really easy to submit your mind, but it's much more difficult to now go ahead and submit your will. And we all go through these different phases. So I want us to look at the slide. I'm going to show you a slide of some things. I'm going to read some of them, and I just want you to evaluate where you are along the journey of faith. Can we go to the next slide? Are you at the hearing? Are you at the believing? Are you at the doing? Okay, so I'll just read it, a few of them, and ask you, just in your own, where are you? Okay, evangelism. We hear we should evangelize. Maybe some of us believe we should evangelize. Do we actually evangelize? Giving. Tithing. We hear we should tithe. Some of us believe it's a good thing. How many of us do it? Missions. Right? We've heard that God has sent us on a mission. We might believe that mission is part of our purpose. How many of us actually are in the phase of doing? Just ask yourself, okay? Where are you in that? Ready? This is a tough one. Forgiving. Forgiving. Right? We have heard in messages that God is asking us to forgive. We've heard that, that confusing verse of we will not be forgiven unless we forgive. We've heard. We might even believe that forgiveness is a good thing, but how many of us are actually moving towards doing? And I want to be clear. I'm not putting these there so we feel like judged, okay? I'm making it visible so that we can just take some time to see where we're at and maybe get a sense of what God is doing in our lives. That if you've heard, that's great, right? There's a reason why God let you hear that truth. If you believe and you acknowledge, like, yes, this truth is something I can agree with, that's great. God is moving you. If you're in the phase of doing it, that's great. But again, sometimes I'm in the doing phase, like missions, right? I'm in the doing phase. Many summers ago, we had so many mission trips. But then there's other times where I'm just like, yeah, that's a good idea. But I also want to put this up there to acknowledge that there are things along our journey that actually stop us from getting to the faith in action, aren't there? There's actually, maybe it's busyness. Like, I just don't have time to go on missions. Maybe it's, I don't know, financial situation. I don't have the money to give. I believe it's important to give, but I don't have the money to give. Maybe it's self-consciousness, right? I want to evangelize, but I don't know what people are going to think of me, or maybe they'll view me as a hypocrite. So I want to acknowledge that this is not meant for us to feel like, oh man, we're not faithful. But I do want to say that we need to be aware that there are things that as we're walking from hearing to believing to doing stop us. And unless we expose and really think about what are those things stopping me from forgiving? What are those things stopping me from being hospitable, right? Honestly, if you know me, hospitality is not my thing. I have heard I should be hospitable. I even understand the importance of being hospitable, but I just don't like people over, okay? I know, my whole Filipino family is hospitable. I could drop by any of my aunt's houses unannounced and they'll welcome me and they'll cook a meal. I'm not like that yet, okay? There are times where, because my wife is more hospitable, I'm brought along to do it, but that's somewhere I struggle with. And that's okay, right? It's something I just want to be aware of, okay? So here, let's bring this home with this idea. Obviously, God wants us to be a people that don't just hear and a people that don't just believe, but God wants us to be a people that do. God wants us to be a people who live in obedience. But let me put this out there. Does God need us to do any of these things? I would say no. I would say that God doesn't need our doing to accomplish his will, but here's what's weird. God doesn't need our doing, but God seldom acts without our participation. Did God need Moses to actually put the staff down in the Red Sea? Is that what activated the wind? I don't think so. I think if God wanted, he could have just dried up the Red Sea. There's other cases where God just does something. He didn't need Moses to do this. God promised Israel the land. So here's my question. Why send spies to check out the city that God already promised was going to be yours anyway? Did God need intel? Did God need military expertise to make it happen? I don't think so. Okay? Did God really need people to walk around Jericho 7 times and scream and yell and blow trumpets before the walls came down? Part of me feels like he was just doing that as a practical joke, right? Right? Like, hey, let's walk around. Did God need them to do that? I don't think so. I think God could have just said a word, the walls would have come down, same result. City would have been conquered, great. But the truth I see in the Bible is that even though God doesn't need us, for some reason, he always chooses to use us, which is weird because we suck, right? Sorry, Aaron, right? God doesn't need us, but for some reason, he always chooses to use us. He's always inviting us to couple our faith and our belief with action. And if I was a spy, here's how I would have felt, right? I would have felt like this. God, I risked my life and you didn't even use any of the information that I obtained for you. Right? Did God use any of the intelligence that the spies gathered? All they saw, I guess, in a bit, all they saw was the people are scared. Okay, and in a sense, God used that. But how many times do we do all these things and then God doesn't even end up using it in the end? Like we do all this prep work. I've been involved in so many Christian events where we do all this prep work in the background and it doesn't even get used. How many times do we feel like that? Like, God, I'm doing all these things. I'm obeying you. In the end, you don't even use what I've done. What's with that? What I want to say is, it's actually the act of obedience, not the act itself or the result of itself, that helps align us with God's will and heart. And so that's why we need to continually be evaluating, where am I in this journey and moving towards doing. We're always meant to play a role and partner with God. Even from the beginning, what did God say to Adam and Eve? Be fruitful and multiply and do what to the earth? Subdue, fill the earth and subdue the earth and make it produce. Could God just have let the earth produce naturally without Adam and Eve? Of course, he created it. He could have created an earth where plants just grew and fruit just grew. He could have, but he said, no, I want you to partner with me and take your faith and actually act on it. And I'm going to use you to make the earth produce the fruit that I want it to produce, even though I could just say a word and it could happen. That's how God operates, is he asks us to be doing, but also partnering with him. The classic story of this, for me, is found in Exodus chapter 17. This is Israel still out in the wilderness, and here's what it says in verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek. Listen, this is weird. This is really strange. While Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill, when Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and the people with the sword. So I want us to notice in this battle, there's two things. There's Moses holding up his staff. What is that? That's a picture of prayer. That's a picture of acknowledging that we need God to help us in this situation. But what else is happening? Down below, Joshua is fighting. Joshua's fighting the actual battle. There's Moses sort of praying, connecting with God, asking for God's help, and there's Joshua actually doing the fighting. So a pastor said this once: the way we ought to live is we have to pray like Moses, but we have to fight like Joshua. We have to pray like Moses, but we have to fight like Joshua. There's a partnership to our doing that involves both us and God. When we try to solve a problem by just praying, or if we try to solve a problem by just doing, without that element of partnering, that's when we get in trouble. When we live life where all we do is pray and wait for God, or when we live life where all we do is do and problem solve without actually acknowledging and waiting for God and force things to happen on our terms, that's when we get in trouble. So in this journey of faith, as we are moving from just hearing to believing to doing, it's very important that we understand that the reason we are actually called to do anything is not because God needs us, but because God wants to partner with us in relationship. That's why we do team building, right? You could accomplish so many things on your own, but things are done with a team to build relationships, to pray like Moses and fight like Josh. So as much as I gave you sort of that inventory of where you are about some of these things, let me just put this out there for us to think about. Are there areas where all we do is pray like Moses? We just pray, we just pray, we just pray, which is not bad, but we just pray. Just doing this. There's a battle, but we're just doing this. Are there areas where all we do is fight like Joshua? I can fix this. I can fix this. I can do this. I have expertise. I will find the strategy. Fight, 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 without the prayer. Just think for a moment. Maybe God will bring up areas where for me, it's always more the fighting. All I'm doing is fighting. Crisis management, problem solving. God's intent is always to partner with you in the doing. God's intent is that you don't do just out of your own strength and will, but with him. So I want to come back to something about faith in the story of Rahab that I've mentioned several times throughout the series. This is my 9th message on Hebrews 11. How long could you possibly spend on Hebrews 11? Apparently more than 9 weeks, okay? But there's this idea of faith that I brought up, of a picture of faith, that maybe faith is just this. It's taking what little we know and taking what little we have and just acting in obedience with that thing and that knowledge in a way that aligns with his heart. Just taking what little you have, taking what little you know, taking what you've heard, taking what little you believe, right? And it doesn't matter how mature you are as a Christian, and just acting in obedience and alignment with our belief in him. I want to see this in the last part of Exodus 17 in the story of Rahab. The men said to her, "We will be guiltless with respect to this oath of yours that you have made us swear." So she said, "Please save my family. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord," can we say cord, "in the window through which you let us down. And you shall gather into your house your father and mother, your brothers, and all your father's household. Then if anyone goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be in his own head, and we shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is with you in the house, his blood shall be on your head. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be guiltless with respect to your oath that you have made us swear. And she said, according to your word, so be it. Then she sent them away and departed. And she tied the scarlet cord, say cord, in the window. That's faith. I'm going to take this little thing I have, this cord. That's what God is telling me to use. This cord, it's meaningless. It's a rope. It's a rope, and I don't know why she had a rope. There's many theories about why she had a red rope. And we can kind of think of the symbolism as to why it's a red rope. And these people just say, just tie this cord on your window and you'll be saved. And if I was Rahab, I always like playing devil's advocate, and I'm a little pessimistic. I would think like, okay, I'm tying this red cord out my window. And part of me is like, is this going to work? Or part of me would be like, this is crazy, right? I'm this nation's about to attack my people, and my safety depends on this rope. I think part of faith sometimes is walking along and just thinking, this is crazy, but you keep walking, right? Like, what are we doing? This is crazy, but you keep walking. Is this going to work? But you keep walking because you're taking what little you know and what little you have, and you're entrusting it to God and using that as an act of faith. She just had a little red rope, right? There's like the story of the fish and the bread. Like, I don't have much. What do you have? I just have this little lunch, right? I don't know why the kid had 5. Is it 5 fish? That's a lot of fish to eat, right? But this is all I have, right? I just have this rope. Okay, God, I'll obey with this rope. I don't know why. I don't see how it's going to work out. This is all I have. This is what you asked me to use. I'm going to use this rope. And you know what's beautiful? In verse 15, sorry. In verse 15, the word used for cord is actually different than the word used in the last part of Exodus. In verse 15, when she said she lowered them with a rope, the Hebrew word is shavel. I'm sure I mispronounced that. But here, when we read about it in verse 18, right? You shall tie the scarlet cord. They use a different word called tikva. Why use a different word? Why can't you just use the word rope twice? It's weird, right? It turns out it's a play on words, because the Hebrew word tikva could mean cord, or listen, it could also mean hope. Isn't that beautiful? Right? Like, on one sense, all human eyes would just see this tikva, this cord, and you could walk by this window and you could be like, oh, there's a red cord hanging by it's just a rope to you. But to her, because she took it, what little she had, and she moved from hearing to believing to doing, it turned from just a simple red cord to actually the source of hope. Isn't that beautiful? Right? That God just takes this little offering. God, I don't have much. I can't do much. I'm untalented. And he somehow takes that cord that we offer and he uses it to bring hope. That's the journey. That's what we're moving towards. So can we take just a moment to just reflect and just with our eyes closed so we're better able to focus. Might you have a talent or an idea, just some tiny little thing in the back of your mind that you would present before God as an act of faith coupled with action, of actually doing what we believe. And maybe God is asking you to bring that forward because he's going to take that cord, that talent, that idea, that whatever it is, and to turn it and use it to bring hope, use it to help creation function as it should. I don't know. Or was there a word today that was mentioned that you're like, something stood out to you, whether it's evangelism or hospitality, or you're just, God maybe is starting to, work in your heart and say, hey, pay attention to this because you're either doing great or maybe you're not all the way over yet, but I want to work on this thing. to move you towards a faith that acts. Or maybe there was something that came to mind where you look at that life situation, you're like, yep, all I'm doing is fighting. I'm fighting like Joshua, but I'm not praying like Moses. I'm doing, but I'm not doing so with partnership in mind. So just take a moment. I just want those things to sort of be clear to you. And if you want to spend maybe just a minute or two praying over it, and then we'll talk about what we'll do next.